Meeting of the Transportation Policy and Planning Board for February 14th, 2022. We do appear to have a quorum. Reva, would you please call the roll?
Grant Foster.
Here.
Keith Furman.
Present.
Barbara Harrington McKinney. Randy Udell.
Here.
Christopher McHale.
Here.
Carolyn McAndrews.
Looks like she's just connecting now.
Here. Thank you. Thomas Wilson.
Here.
Baltazar Deanna Santana.
Here.
Margaret Bergamini. And Bedranath Lakala.
Present.
Thank you, Reva. We do have a quorum, so this meeting is called to order. Jesse, if you would please proceed with our standard virtual meetings opening statement.
Right. Welcome to our Transportation Policy and Planning Board virtual meeting. If you lose connection at any point during the meeting, you can reconnect by clicking the link or calling the number in your original email. Members, if you are able, please activate your video for the purposes of quorum and keep it on for the duration of the meeting. Staff, if you are able, please activate your video when you are speaking. All panelists, that is alders, board members, and staff, you have the ability to mute and unmute yourselves. Use the raise hand feature when you'd like to be recognized to speak, ask questions, or request a roll call vote. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. Members of the public who have registered to speak, the name you entered in Zoom must match the name you entered in registration. You will remain muted until called upon. The clerk will tell you when your time is up. After speaking, a member of the body may ask you a question. If you need to share documentation with the board, please send it to the email list in today's agenda. Chair, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Jesse. All right, approval of minutes from our January 31st, 2022 meeting. Assuming all board members have had a chance to review those minutes, if they so chose, is there a motion to approve? Motion by Badri, is there a second? Second by Chris McCahill. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving our minutes from the January 31st, 2022 meeting, please unmute yourselves and say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Chair believes unanimous. If you'd like to register a no vote, please raise your hand. Seeing no hands raised, they'll go down as unanimous. Thank you. Are there any communications, disclosures, or recusals from members of the board? Seeing none, are there any registrants for public comment for items not on the agenda?
I have none, just for item 8.
Thank you. All right, then we will move on to Legistar 69502, the Transportation Annual Operation Report.
There we go. Great. So I'll start this and make sure that. Okay. So does the board see this in presentation view? Okay, good. Yeah. So I guess by ordinance, every year I'm supposed to provide a report on the operations of the department. But over the last 2 years, it's been quite interesting because I can also take just a step back and review the transportation trends. And I think these trends are really quite interesting, and I think they're also quite relevant. You know, every board meeting, you board members make decisions regarding a very specific Legistar item, right? But this, you know, where is transportation going provides kind of the context for all those decisions and for all of our efforts. If we look at some of the transportation trends, this is the national vehicle miles traveled. This was obtained from the FHWA. The Federal Border Reserve in St. Louis also provides something. But the last time we had kind of a plateauing of vehicle miles traveled that had to do with the recession in 2008, and it was largely due to unemployment. This has been more a result of the pandemic, and yet it's really not associated with unemployment, because our unemployment figures are probably at their lowest that they've been for decades, if I believe. So there's a thought that the telework is probably going to influence things, and we're going to have to probably adjust to a different normal or a new normal. That's what the national looks like. What does it look like right now? And we keep track of vehicle volumes on certain streets from our traffic controllers. And if we look at Atwood Avenue, and we take a snapshot right around October, because I feel like October is a somewhat reasonable month to provide what things might look like, because school is back in session. We haven't entered the Omicron variant kind of adjustment that everyone's had to make. So what do things look like in October might provide a glimpse of what things look like, post-pandemic. And while streets nationally are at about 98% of where they were in 2019, we aren't seeing that increase in mass at Atwood Avenue. If we look at October, we're at about 85% of 2019. Monroe Street, about 92%. Park Street, about 89%. And so those graphics were all City of Madison data. So I thought, well, maybe our data is wrong. So I took some data from Wisconsin DOT for the Beltline, and sometimes their traffic recorders go out, so we don't have continuous data. But if we look at I believe September on the Beltline, just east of Broadway, the Beltline was only about 91% of what 2019 was. We're losing a lot of the volume, not so much during the day, but quite a bit of it is occurring during the peak. So our morning peak is about 59%. This is East Washington, for one example. 59% of what it was into that 2019. Our afternoon peak is about 70%. And, we typically design our roadways for the peak. And so the reduced volumes during the peak, is pertinent as we start looking at designing roadways or reconstructing roadways. We had kind of a similar type of situation with our bicycle counts. Now, these are just the ecom totem counts. Initially, right after the pandemic, it seemed as though we were getting quite a bit of recreational traffic. But when you look at it over 2 years, the bicycle counts on the Southwest path are down by about 17%. On the Capital City Trail, down by about 11%. One caveat is that in July of 21, there was some construction downstream on the Southwest path, which may have affected, maybe some people weren't using the Southwest path. But it seems like the same reduction in work trips that we're seeing perhaps on our roadways during the peak periods, we might be also seeing them for bike commute trips, right? The MPO, Greater Madison MPO, does this telework survey. They did it for COVID-19, and then they redid it again with slightly refined questions in October of 2021. And this was their responses. This is responses from the executives and managers only. So this is not the common workforce. This is just like people who are making decisions about where people work. And the question is, what impact do you believe the COVID-19 pandemic will have on workplace norms at your organization? More will work from home on a weekly basis. Please excuse the loss of an E. More will work from home nearly full time. will consider the reducing the physical size of the workplace. None of the above. And you can see how quite a few executives and managers seem to be quite open to people working from home. So if you think about it, if a person works from home just one day a week, that has the potential to reduce, peak hour traffic volumes by 20%. So, this could be a big deal. Unfortunately, our traffic-related fatal crash trends, we continue to see high fatalities. 2021, we have 12 fatal crashes with 14 traffic fatalities. At some point, we thought that this had to do with just higher travel speeds. But when we look at our streetlight data, we're not seeing as much of the higher travel speeds, but we're just seeing more of a kind of exhibitionist driving. I think that's what they're calling it. Like the city of Oakland, I was on a webinar and they were just mentioning how some vehicles are just doing donuts in the middle of intersections just because they can. I think there's just been an increase in rude, non-compliant behavior that perhaps is a product of COVID, but lots of cities are seeing this. If we look at transit, in 2021, if we look at October, again, when the university's in session, we're about 66% of our passengers of 2019. And then the ridership by trip start time, you can see that the 2021 ridership on transit is very similar to the dips that we're seeing during our peak hour, right? So we're not seeing our rush hour auto trips, and we're not seeing our rush hour transit trips as much, which probably means that we're getting more riders, or the riders that we have right now are riders that may be more reliant on transit to just take care of their everyday needs. If we look at the next thing, the October riders per revenue hour, this is a kind of a measure of transit efficiency at how well we're doing. And nationally, I'm going to say that Madison has typically compared well with other transit systems because we have a high number of riders per revenue hour, which dropped considerably in 2020. But if you look in 2021, we're back up to 26. Now, partly that's reduced to our revenue hours. We only have 80% of our revenue hours, and it's difficult for us to have much more than that just because of a shortage of drivers. Here, there you can see the check 2021, and I did check the 2021, and that's correct. So our revenue hours are roughly about 80% of what they were in 2019. And if we wanted to increase them, we would have difficulty doing it just because like schools and the like, everyone is having trouble finding commercial drivers. We look at the fare revenue. Our fare revenue for 2021 is similar to 2020. If you think about 2020, we had 3 pretty good months of transit ridership, regular revenues on transit before the pandemic hit, and then we had a lot of fare free, actually operating fare free. 2021, it's been more consistent. However, it's been lower. And right now, you can see that we're about $6 million lower than what we're used to collecting. Now, the CARE Acts and the various relief packages are helping us right now, but it's important for us to see if we can grow our fare revenue, back to where it was. Parking garage, average peak occupancy. Here you can see that has suffered as well. Our parking revenue has taken a particularly difficult hit. I'd say perhaps in 2019, generally the parking division collected more money than it spent, whereas now, I think last year we collected about $3 million less than it cost us to operate the parking division. And you can see that the largest reduction in revenue is coming from the garages. If we look at it a different way, this is the average peak occupancy, and this graph has a lot of information. The light gray, represents the number of parking spaces. Okay. The dark gray represents 2019, which may be what we consider a baseline. The red is 2020, and the blue is 2021. Some parking garages, like State Street campus, have recovered, but most of the parking garages that are really have not recovered are the ones that are really serve employment uses, like the Brayton lot, the Government East and Wilson Street, and Livingston. And so you think about it, we sell parking passes, monthly parking passes. But if you're only coming into the office, let's say 8 or 12 times a month, you may not want to buy a parking pass, right? Because, it impacts our parking rates and how we attract parkers compared to some of other properties around us that are providing parking as well. Then we also have parking citations. And so this is our parking citations by year, 2018 through 2021. We want to emphasize that the goal is compliance, not revenue collection. Oftentimes the revenue collection, we as a division don't see that revenue, right? It goes into the city budget. But parking citations do help us with compliance. Here is the parking enforcement revenue versus the parking enforcement budget. So there you can kind of see how much were we taking in parking enforcement revenue, which went to the general fund, versus how much is being used for parking enforcement. And so in 2021, the citations were about compensating for the amount that the enforcement was costing. So some of the takeaways, as we think about it, telework may permanently reduce peak hour trips of all modes, not just motor vehicle, but in our transit, but in our bike. And, we're basically 1 month away from being 2 years into this, right? And so we're at a point where maybe we have to start thinking, well, maybe this is the new normal, or maybe we are starting to get a picture of what the new normal is. And if it is, how does that change the way we do things? So if true, then it might provide opportunities to rebalance street space. One example of that is Whitney Way, where we've always had 4 lanes, on Whitney Way, which kind of served University. And when BRT gets implemented, we're reducing that to 2 lanes because it's borderline. The old volumes would suggest that we need 4 lanes, but the new volumes suggest that maybe 2 is sufficient. So how do we want to rebalance it? Rebalance the transit revenue hours to off-peak. We had a very peak-oriented system, which helped people that worked in offices downtown, but didn't necessarily help people that had non-traditional hours, right? And so then the network redesign is seeking to kind of reduce the peak hour service and provide a more consistent, uniform service through the day. And then we need to really kind of reevaluate our parking policy, patrons, and rates. And I'm very aware of this right now that Sabrina has gone there. I'm diving into this and I'm seeing that we do have to perhaps adjust some of the rates of our garages and think about what is the new mission of our parking utility. The second part of the report has to do what we've done, each traffic division has done through 2021, and that's included in the report, the 15-page report. Because of the length of tonight's meeting, I think maybe it's best that I don't go through it, but I will say that our divisions have done quite a bit. If you think about the major initiatives that are going on, which include Vision Zero, the complete green streets, LED conversion, absorbing PEOs, absorbing crossing staff, getting the first satellite facility for Metro Transit, something we've been trying to do for 10 years. Bus rapid transit being recommended for funding. That was huge. We thought that would take years, and instead we got recommended, after our submittal. So quite a bit of work that I won't discuss, though I will say I'm proud of the divisions because I think they are making major strides and moving us in positive directions. So that's it. I'm open for questions or comments.
Thank you, Tom. Any questions? Walter Foster, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Tom, for the report, and I agree there's been a lot of really great work done. Just one question on the reevaluation, parking policy, et cetera. Do you have any thoughts on how that should potentially play into the final details on the Lake Street ramp replacement? I know that was talked about a little bit, before the RFP went out. But if, with all of that extra capacity and all of those facilities, is there any reason to rethink the ideal number that we want to construct there?
I think that discussion will be in play. In fact, I was just talking with it. The State Street campus, for some reason, seems to be our most successful garage right now. But the costs associated with building that parking or replacing that parking are pretty high. And the submittals, they range from about $40,000 a space to $70,000 a space. And so I feel like that's a legitimate policy issue if all the spaces should be replaced at a 1-to-1 ratio or not. So,
do you have any thoughts of the best way for this board to kind of take up that question and to get, and I think finance is going to be kind of on point for all components. I guess what's the best way to get something we should at least kind of take a look at more in depth, especially with BRT access right there as well. It feels like there's an opportunity for us to make sure that we overbuild, I guess.
Yeah. On that particular one, staff has prepared is preparing a recommendation to finance, and then to which I think it's getting. TC is also going to be involved. The changing kind of the parameters of the RFP, we're not able to do that right now. Because, like, for instance, there were questions saying, well, could you rearrange this or could you rearrange that on specific proposals? And right now, if we start doing that with one of the proposers, that we have to do it with all of the 7 proposers. So I think the idea is that basically the developer will be selected based on what the RFP said, but then there will be a negotiation on, all right, this is what we said in the RFP, but we would like some changes. Like we would like the bus circulation to go like this instead of like this. We might not want the base, the underground parking to occur or something to that. So I think those will be issues. I think the first issue will be the selection of the developer, but then after that developer is selected, then I think there are not only in the parking, but also kind of in the inner city bus terminal circulation, how we would maybe want some things changed, as well as some of the parking dimensions. There's quite a few changes that we would like considered. However, I don't think it's Purchasing has told us that we can't necessarily ask one developer to make a bunch of changes to make their proposal better and not ask all of them. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think what we're going to do is use the consistent set of requirements to select the developer and then work with them beyond that.
That makes sense. And I see Ann Kovich is on here as well. So I guess I'll just trust between, you and staff kind of being prepared to have that conversation at TC, and then for that conversation to happen there. I'm glad it's on the radar, and I think it is really important one to have. And I think it's fine that it happens after there's a selection of the vendor, but before we sign on the dotted line and commit to potentially more parking spots than we actually really want for 20 years in the future. So glad it's on the radar. Thank you.
All right, any further questions, comments for Tom? All right, seeing none, thank you, Tom. We'll then move on to Legistar 69519, amending the City of Madison official map to establish map reservations for future streets and highways in the City of Madison, consistent with recommendations in the adopted Oscar Mayer Special Area Plan.
Hello, that is me. My name is Dan McCall. For those who haven't met, I believe I've met most of you before. I am the staff planner who was managing the Oscar Mayer Special Area Plan, and I'm going to discuss a couple of the official map recommendations that we have prepared. Let me share my screen really quick. All right, can everybody see? All right, so looks like everybody can see it. So the Oscar Mayer Plan was adopted in July of 2020 after a very lengthy meeting. At the very end of that meeting, the council added a kind of a whereas clause to the adopting resolution that directed staff to prepare recommendations for rezoning, proactive rezonings. And along with that, we believe that official mappings are appropriate based on some past actions of the council as well as Plan Commission and this body. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Hold on 1 second. All right. This is the recommended future land use and streets plan of the Oscar Mayer. A couple big ideas just to kind of maybe rekindle some memories. Really focus on a mixed use district along Commercial Avenue with an employment focus on the former Oscar Mayer site, transitioning to more mixed residential on the former Hartmeyer site as you kind of cross the rail corridor. A lot of employment through the balance of the site. Really hoping to keep this a kind of a mix between employment and residential area. Upon receiving that direction, we had a couple neighborhood meetings. We also met with Plan Commission to kind of take their temperature on what their thoughts and we kind of came to a recognition that there really were a few critical streets that warrant official mapping in this particular context. The first was the connection between Packers and North Sherman on Coolidge and Roth Street. So, and this is this concept showing Roth Street realigned and crossing south of the main facility at Oscar Mayer, as well as the Ruskin to Huxley connection. So those primary north-south and east-west connections to that site really kind of becoming the armature of neighborhood streets in the area. The other street that we saw as appropriate is on the MG&E site connecting Shopko to Pancrats on that site as well. So these largely follow the design recommendations that were in the adopted plan. What this is showing is a little bit of the deviation that has changed since that plan was adopted, as we really kind of focused in on getting the details of these street alignments correct. One of the things that we were asked to do is really kind of focus or avoid an area of oaks on the Hartmeyer property. We were able to shift that curvature so it occurs more to the east, as well as getting a little bit more visibility or a straight line visibility before the curving to the south. So that kind of necessitated that change through there. Really, really minor. The second change is on the Oscar Mayer site itself. The plan had showed kind of a jog in the street. Working with TE, they felt it was more appropriate just have a straight connection through there. But again, very similar in terms of the alignment and locations. This is what that looks like in your packet. I'm sure you've probably seen this before, largely following the, again, kind of the existing, the alignment as shown in the plan. One thing to note, actually, I'm going to go back to this slide here. It's easier to see. The official map does cover a couple portions of existing buildings off Ruskin. This was done to avoid conflicts with the wetland shown in this kind of blue color over here. And so that was a decision that was made during the planning process, but it does become a little more relevant as we move into official mapping. The second one, as I mentioned before, is on the Pancrats and Shopko Drive. And I recognize that this is a separate agenda item, but it might just be appropriate to discuss these initially together before acting on them separately. This is kind of shown through the middle of the plan. We have had conversations with MG&E about their long-term vision to move some of their facilities out here. We have stressed that, we really look at this as kind of two endpoints, and wherever that connection that goes on through those, if it needs to align or shift, that is fine. We do view this as a reservation. As long as the future alignment works from an engineering perspective, we are absolutely fine if it shifts. That is really all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions from the board.
Thank you, Dan. Before we go to questions real quick, is there any objection from board members for taking up items 4 and 5? So, I'm sorry, items 3 and 4. So adding Legistar 69518, amending the City of Madison official map to establish map reservations for future streets and highways in the City of Madison to connect Shopko Drive and Pancrat Street, consistent with the recommendations in the adopted Oscar Mayer Special Area Plan. Any objection to taking up those two items together and having our discussion and questions about those two items together? Okay, seeing none, that's what we will do. Questions or comments? Chris, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Maybe you could just provide a little clarification and context for folks that are seeing this sort of thing for the first time. So we're talking about amending the official map. So have we already set the official map in accordance with the original plan, or is this the first time? And then a follow-up. So maybe in that you can explain to folks, remind folks again what we're actually talking about. And then maybe set some context on, does it make sense to amend the official map now if there's still changes in the works yeah.
Sure. So when the city adopted the plan, what they effectively did is they gave planning division staff basically the basis of review for future development proposals. It doesn't necessarily require those alignments to follow exactly where those streets. There's historically been a level of flexibility Because we understand that, we're developing a plan that we don't have 100% perfect information. So we want to see kind of how those things play out. So we have the idea to officially map is kind of a relatively new, or I should say, we have renewed interest in officially mapping really for these really important streets that we see, and having a little bit of flexibility. So what the official mapping does is it does kind of say, it gives the development community, like, these are the streets that are the most important, particularly in this plan, the Roth, Ruskin, Coolidge, and Huxley, those connections, those are relatively fixed. I think there's been a lot of discussion and debate about those alignments and the impacts that they have on surrounding land use. So this would be taking up the official map reservations for the first time on this plan. Did I answer everything?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Thanks. Then I think this all makes sense. One last question for context. Does the neighborhood plan still sort of suggest that there won't be an extension through to Coolidge Street? Am I remembering that right?
Yes. The official map reservation does not change that element of the plan. That plan envisions a three-way intersection with Packers and the extension of Coolidge, with pedestrian and bike access into Eakin Park as well. This is just reserving the future right-of-way on the Oscar Mayer and former Hartmeyer property.
Thanks.
Thank you. Alder Foster, go ahead, please.
Thank you. And thanks, Dan. I'm supportive of both of these proposed changes to the official map. I wanted to ask if there was any discussion by staff around reservations for the proposed future bike paths. I know there was, I had a little bit of discussion with the attorney's office. I think there was some maybe initial confusion about whether we could or couldn't do that. My understanding is that we can. So I'm just curious if that was kind of what planning's understanding was.
I think we did not, I would say we did not really extensively consider, I should say, we didn't go into a in-depth evaluation of whether that makes sense. I think we kind of thought originally, let's focus on the streets. The bike paths are a far easier, those corridors are easier to obtain, particularly adjacent to the right-of-way on these. I think we're comfortable with the ability of the development teams and our staff to achieve those through the platting and conditional use processes. But that's a good point. It's a very astute observation that these do not include those bike reservations. It is at this point only the street reservations that is included in this.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, hopefully we could. I think, and I was one of the sort of the folks that kind of encouraged us to reconsider use of the official mapping tool, and I think it is really beneficial. I mean, for developers, for everybody to get kind of, when we're serious about something, to get it on there. And I think it really just helps kind of signal to everybody involved, this is this really is something that we're working towards. So I don't know if you think there've been any issues with it, but I guess I'd like to ask for staff to go back and take a look. I mean, I'm happy to support both of these to move forward, but to take another look at the sort of bike component of it and come back with recommendations of which, if any of those, you would recommend adding as on the map as well. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to share my screen again really quick, just to, I would say, just kind of speed off the cuff. The bike path, the primary bike path that we would like to see achieved through this would be the kind of a connection from First all the way up to Coolidge on the just to the east of the rail right away. And that requires working with MG&E to allow access on they have an outlot where they have power transmission lines. And if we can access that at the southern end, that becomes very feasible. I think that's kind of the challenge, is identifying that exact alignment, because the buildings kind of right in the corner are all the way up to the rail corridor or the rail yards. The railroad tower have been historically
challenging to work with. It's probably the best. And so I think that's a great point. That would be the one I think that if we do proceed with official mapping of those by corridors, that would be the one that is, in my mind, the most significant.
Yeah, I would agree. And I mean, I think those, most of the parcels along there are being actively marketed right now for sale, and I think likely redevelopment. So that's just another reason why getting it on the map would be good. So people don't seem surprised when we're saying, yeah, we're looking at it. And again, with some flexibility and alignment, just like the Shopko one, for example. I think the continuation of that I think in the plan, it shows on the west side of the tracks, kind of switching over at Coolidge Roth and continuing up to Aberg. I think that one also feels like an important one to make, consider that as well. And then there's also the sort of, it looks like a bit of a kind of rail parallel to the rail closer to North Sherman. And then also maybe like a little bit along the existing right of way of Aberg itself to get an extension of that side path. So yeah, if you could take a look at all that and come back with sort of some recommendations around, which ones you would recommend for mapping, which ones not, and why, that would be awesome. Thank you.
All right, any further questions or discussion on either of these two items 3 or 4? Okay, seeing no hands raised, is there a motion to approve both together? Chris, go ahead, please.
I'll move that. If you want to do it this way, we'll approve both those items.
Thank you. Motion. Is there a second? Randy, second. Discussion. Chris, did you want to speak to your motion? Okay. Any further discussion? All right. All those in favor of approving items 3 and 4, that's Legistar 69519, amending the City of Madison official map to establish map reservations for future streets and highways in the City of Madison, consistent with recommendations in the adopted Oscar Mayer Special Area Plan, and Legistar 69518, amending the City of Madison official map to establish map reservations for future streets and highways in the City of Madison to connect Shopko Drive and Pancrat Street, consistent with recommendations in the adopted Oscar Mayer Special Area Plan. Please unmute yourselves and say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Chair believes unanimous. If you'd like to register a no vote, please raise your hand. Seeing no hands raised, those will go down as unanimous. Thank you. Now our next items, I think Legistar 5, 6, and 7 are all related, so it may make sense to take them up together. That's the Roadway Cafe permit, the streetery expansion, and a discussion of streetery and street parking. Any objection to taking up kind of those 3 items together? Tom, does that make sense to you? Okay. Seeing no objections, we will do that, and then we'll just begin with item 5 then, Legislar 69379, creating section 10.30 of the Madison General Ordinances to create the Roadway Cafe permit to allow for the expansion of licensed sidewalk cafes into the roadway, and amending sections 12.12, 1425, 38.05, 3E1, and 1.08, 3A accordingly, and 1.084 accordingly. And then Legislar 69380, creating section 9.135, sidewalk cafe and roadway cafe expansion licenses to create a new roadway cafe expansion license and make the streetery program for sidewalk cafes permanent, creating section 9.136, street vending on the State Street Mall Capital Concourse, repealing section 9.13, license for selling on public streets, and recreating section 9.13 as street vending licenses, and amending sections 9.12, 1.083A, and 1.084 accordingly. Okay, that was quite a mouthful. All right, we're ready for our presentation, I believe. Hi, Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and being able to take a moment to explain all of these major changes that you have in front of you. Before I do that, though, I want to zoom back a little bit to give an overview of where we've been and how we've gotten to here. So as you may be aware, during COVID, under an emergency order, we created the streetery program. We cobbled together our existing permits and got to today. So, but when we were reviewing all of the existing permits and process that we had, we determined that it was not really the types of uses, those permits were not designed for the type of use that we were looking to do. So through a lot of communication with the business owners, with staff, with policymakers, and related organizations, getting feedback on the things that worked really well, feedback on the things that were more challenging. We tried to address that within this package you see before you. I do want to note, we're really just talking about those two items that were mentioned today, but alongside of that, we have two additional changes that you might have seen in our summary of ordinance changes. We have some amendments to Chapter 28 that really have to do with cleaning up some language in the alcohol licensing to identify more clearly about outdoor premises as it relates to the alcohol license. In street vending under Chapter 9.13, we have the ordinance and then an additional ride-along set of regulations that we use, especially for the mall concourse or the downtown area. We are pulling out the sidewalk cafe items out of the regulations and putting them into the body of the ordinance. And kudos to Lara Manella for doing an amazing job at reworking that so it's a much more readable and user-friendly document. Additionally, throughout all of this, we have been working on creating consistent language across all ordinances that touch each other, but especially within 9.13. So you'll notice some things where we did some language cleanup to try and make it a little more, try to explain it with what the use really is, and trying to make the language work within that. Additionally, there is a ordinance changes to the private property piece that you won't see here because we're discussing the right-of-way, specifically the roadway, but I do want people to be aware because we have business operators that use private property space, the sidewalk, and the roadway currently. And so we're trying to have this all ride through the legislative process to be out the other side all at the same time so we can explain to our business owners what to do based on the type of space that they're using. So while we're not discussing a number of those, they are riding along. And if you're in other meetings, you may see them pop up. And I just wanted you to be aware so you weren't confused why we weren't discussing all of those pieces today. So with that preamble, excuse me, I'm going to go through and just really call out the changes. First and foremost, we're going to start with the roadway cafe permit. And I'm going to call out some of the changes. So within this, we needed to create a new section called 10.30. That is what is going to be called the roadway cafe permit. We needed to do that because we were using the street occupancy permit, and that was really more designed for like a dumpster or like that type of use. And so to move through all of that, we created the new 10.30. Traffic engineering will review that permit, and other agencies such as streets or metro, depending on where the cafe is located. I guess one other thing I should say, to really work on being business friendly to our operators that are applying for these permits and licenses, we are going to have everyone apply through the sidewalk cafe license application. And then within there, based on what they choose, we'll determine what staff need to approve what, and if it moves into this roadway cafe permit. So if they're only using the sidewalk, it won't shift into this space, but we're allowing them to apply at one place to then get all of the outputs in their licenses when we're all done. So traffic engineering will be responsible for reviewing the roadway cafe permits as well as other agencies as applicable. The permit fee will be paid through the sidewalk cafe license. So that application, through that, we will work out the back end, how the money gets divided into the budget appropriately. But they will only have to pay through that sidewalk cafe application. and street vending will issue that. The adjoining roadway spaces may be permitted to more than one establishment, but we will determine that through delineators in the roadway and other ways to identify who's using which space. And each operator will pay for the space that they are using. So they will not be paying for like the entire block if they're only using a section of it. Related to the parking stalls, they cannot use only a partial parking stall. So if it's angled parking, they would need to use like a full parking stall so we don't lose stalls to no use or only partial use. No vehicles will be allowed to park within the cafe area. That was an issue in at least one streetery where people were using it for parking during the day and then seating for their own personal parking during the day and seating for the evening. So that is no longer allowed. Additionally, we had to make some amendments to allow the parking meters to be placed out of service for the roadway cafe permit, and then addressing the licensing fees within that. And the majority of these fees will cover some loss in meter revenue. And then additionally, we needed to make some of those changes to clean up the language related to alcohol licensing in the roadway and making that permanent. So that is really the overview of the first ID, which is 69379, creating the new MGO 10.30, the roadway cafe permit. I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions related to that before we move into the next section.
Any questions or comments? All right, thanks, Megan. Continue.
Okay. So moving on to the street vending changes that relate to the use of the sidewalk and roadway. Like we mentioned earlier, we're trying to condense everything into a new section related to sidewalk cafes, section 9.135. Within that, the highlights are we did make most of the changes permanent. The word streetery, though, you'll notice isn't in the ordinance or in the ordinance language. Although I don't see that word going away as people describe outdoor dining as a streetery. But when we were working on language, streetery wasn't an understandable thing if we thought 10 years from now. And so roadway cafe expansion really clearly describes what is happening within the roadway. So that is why we chose to change that language. Although, like I said, I don't see streetery going away and people not referring it to that for a very long time. So we will probably continue to hear that and we'll probably ourselves use it, but within the back end, it is the roadway cafe expansion permit and license. We are moving all of the existing rules, like I said, out of the regs and combining them all into section 9.135. This also then creates a new roadway cafe expansion license. So they'll get a permit to make sure that they've done everything accordingly in the roadway and have all the right curb stops, delineators, those sorts of things. And then when all is said and done, they will also be issued a roadway cafe expansion license and a sidewalk cafe license, as well as the permit. That'll all be on one document or one report that the operators will get. But it will clearly identify that they've gone through all of these processes and have approvals from the appropriate agencies. You can kind of consider it an add-on to the regular sidewalk cafe license if that helps sort of make sense of all of these new pieces. And it does also, and it allows that to expand out into the right of ways. Additionally, the license fees are all now pulled together into one table related directly to the sidewalk cafe licenses. We have a big table in chapter 9.13 that tells all of our different license types and what their costs are. We broke out the sidewalk cafe section to bring it down a little closer to where it actually makes sense for people to reference it. it is important to note that we are doing a seasonal approach. So we have the April 15th, which is our current start to our vending season, through November 14th. November 15th, as most of you are aware, is the changeover to alternate side parking for our snow removal. So we decided to have, we chose to do a 7-month seasonal operations that most of our operators will use. We do have a winter add-on, but within the winter add-on, there are additional steps and approvals that need to take place if related to streets and snow removal. So we have only seen South Pinckney Street actually utilize the winter operations to its fullest. Most everyone else, if they're using winter operations, have moved up onto the sidewalk and out of the roadway at that point. So it seems to be about when people make that shift anyway. It is a prorated fee to be able to use the in winter, because most likely people will use it less, as opposed to the seasonal, where it is currently $7.50 per square foot in the roadway in the mall concourse, and $5 per square foot to use the roadway outside of the mall concourse. When I refer to the mall concourse, I do mean downtown. It's a designated area. If you're not familiar, it's basically the Capitol Square all the way down State Street to State Street Mall, and about a block to 2 blocks out in each direction. It's also the approximate boundaries of the Business Improvement District, or the BID downtown. So most of our operators are used to that being different. Currently, the sidewalk cafe license fees are different for the mall concourse versus outside of the mall concourse. So we kept that system the same. And in 2016, I believe we went from price per chair to price per square foot for sidewalk cafes. It also mimics what operators are used to paying inside for indoor space. They're used to paying price per square foot. So it made consistency in language and how we were charging fees to hopefully make that more understandable. Within this proposal, we are not suggesting changing the fee structure for the use of the sidewalk, only adding an option to use the roadway and a different fee structure to utilize that space. Some other pieces just to touch on. We are asking that operators will still be able to expand laterally. So that would be to the right or to the left of their business, if appropriate, and if the space allows. And right now it has written that the neighboring businesses, both tenant and property owner, would need to give permission. The main piece behind that is to make sure that there's communication between the businesses that are operating on either side if a business is looking to expand laterally. That lateral expansion could also move into the roadway, or it could just be an operator just wanting to use the sidewalk and only asking to expand laterally. So State Street is a good example. You can't really expand into the roadway because there's no parking, there's no extra space, as we've noticed in the past. But that would still allow operators to expand to the right and to the left to expand their square footage. That is different than in the past. We decided to, or we put in here that all establishments that were currently able to participate in the streetery over the last 2 years would still be able to, as long as they have approvals from the appropriate agencies for alcohol consumption. So with restaurant, bars, wineries, distilleries, meaderies, breweries, all the IRRIs, those have state approvals for their liquor licenses, and they don't have a City of Madison liquor license because they are usually doing some distribution and they're self-distributing, and the liquor laws get a little confusing, but it allows that the state has given them permission to use, that they say it's okay for their alcohol to go outside, or the ALRC has granted that permission within that process. So it just ensures that we're getting approval that whatever the licensing body is for alcohol, that they're on the same page, that they're going to be using the right of way for that type of activity. we are allowing heaters again in this iteration with, of course, fire department approval. So if a operator says they want to use outdoor heating elements, we would certainly include the fire department at that point in these approvals. Light boxes and planters and other decorative items that have become popular are going to continue, although we will have to readjust where some of those boxes are. So they are in the roadway versus on the sidewalk, unless they can be brought in regularly. You'll notice storage is a big piece. For the way that this is currently proposed, all items on the sidewalk and the terrace would need to come in nightly. And if you have approvals for the roadway, you may store your equipment within the roadway, but it would have to be secured and stored overnight. And so that is the way it is proposed right now. Outside of the mall concourse, there may be some potentials to allow that use out overnight, but that would be on a case-by-case basis and would have to depend on a number of factors if that would be approved or not. Just a couple things left here within this section. So roadway cafes must have written snow removal plans if they plan on going into the winter. That would also include the mall concourse, mall crew, as well as streets to make sure that they can be compliant with the snow removal requirements. Oh, and I just shut that down on myself. I apologize. Give me 1 second to pull that back up. I went to click over and apparently I clicked closed. So give me 1 moment, please. And now I have to wait for technology to catch up. All right, just a couple things left, like I said. So yes, the snow removal, making sure we have active snow removal plans. Sidewalk cafes may not be located directly adjacent to or blocking a parking space reserved for people with disabilities. Although if we can readjust those within the area, we can look into that. Again, that's where parking utility would be involved in those approvals and any changes of where those ADA accessible stalls are located and how they are ensured that they're where they need to be. And then we can be in compliance with that. And a couple things to highlight that we are not making part of our permanent is that the rules over the last 2 years have been really relaxed about keeping stuff out overnight. That is going to change back to where it had been pre-pandemic. Operators cannot use the city electrical for operating any lighting or anything within their cafe. They have to use the receptacle on their building. And of course, there are specific height requirements for any cords, that sort of thing, to keep them high enough that they're not in the way of any bobcats, people, or anything else that might be walking up and down the pedestrian right of way. Some establishments may not qualify for winter operations if they cannot be in compliance with the snow removal requirements. Amplified sound and or live music performances will not be allowed in sidewalk cafes or in roadway cafes. There are ways that people can play music, but they need to be in different spaces and not within the cafes. And last but not least, we will be charging fees beginning this for this vending season, which begins on April 15th of 2022. And that includes all license types, not just sidewalk cafes. That is my overview to the major changes that you see before you in the body of those items. Are there questions?
Thanks, Megan. We did have one public comment that was sent in just before our meeting, so I will read that briefly here in case board members have not had a chance to see that from their email. It's from an Ann Walker. Dear members, the Street Read program is pretty exciting. In addition to creating more space for businesses, it's also an opportunity to rethink how we use our public space and think about neighborhoods. Usually with a new program, there needs to be a bit of tweaking to get it right. What I would like to see advocated for are one, education, outreach, and care for our urban trees tied into the streetery program. Canopy trees enhance and are essential to our city. A portion of fees collected for the program should be used to care for this long-term asset. Advocate for adequate bike parking within the program, i.e. bike corrals. Guidelines for hours of operation, including setup and end of shift duties. Guidelines for amplified live music as well as speaker systems. Lighting, as well as garbage collection, use of leaf blowers, loud equipment. Note, leaf blowers are commonly used in the downtown to freshen up outdoor dining areas. I live close to an outdoor eating area that is open all day, including breakfast on the weekends. Leaf blowers have been used as early as 5:30 a.m. I live in District 6, an area with quite a few existing outdoor patios, etc. On outdoor patios, the neighborhood as well as the neighborhood association has long advocated for lighting which respects the needs of both the businesses and neighbors. Lighting should be sufficient for the business's needs, but not create glare or spill over onto neighbors' property. Somehow I think the topic of visually separating a patio from immediate neighbors needs to be addressed. I think a lot of neighbors want to support businesses in our neighborhood and maintain the use and enjoyment of our yards, homes. In District 6, businesses and homes are often right next door to each other. Cigarette butts can also be an issue. Business owners should be required to provide receptacles. With new patios, I think could be helpful to have some kind of check in for the business owner and immediate neighbors to make sure things are working well. I think that's the only public comment we had for those two items. So questions?
I did want to just touch on some of the things within Anne's email that I didn't call out in this presentation, but
yeah, go ahead.
Are important to note. Her question about the street trees, we do have a section in there that does talk about how nothing can be attached or secured to a tree, that they should not be used as part of the enclosure, that sort of thing. And the forestry department did recently create a new permit to wrap street trees with lights, but it has to go through their approval process and be done, I believe, by a certified lighting specialist. And so there are ways to do that that really do take into consideration our street trees. And so that is a big piece of that. And I do have an email that Anne had sent that's different than this letter that I will be responding to her about some of these thoughts and concerns as well. Something important to note about the funds and just her question, and you all might have a question about this. We did work with parking utility quite extensively and traffic engineering as we looked at these fee structures and how it would cover the work of staff processing that and moving through everything. So on our seasonal approach on the back end, 80% of that fee recouped would go to the parking utility, and then 10% to traffic engineering and 10% to economic development for the staff work related to processing and working with the operators. And then if you flip that to the winter operations, it's in the opposite direction. So 80%, which is really 40 and 40, go to traffic engineering and economic development, with 20% going to parking utility, because most likely they will have more people using on-street parking in the winter time as it relates to that. And for traffic engineering and economic development, all of our funds go to the general fund. So they go within that. Only parking utility has its own set of budgetary requirements and things as it's a utility. So really, when you look at it broken up that way, it will be on the accounting lines, but it really is going into the general fund for those percentages.
Thank you. Any questions? Comments or discussion? We also have on item 7, a sort of a placeholder for continued streetery and street parking discussion. If there's anything that any discussion that needs to take place or wants to take place by any members, that can happen now. Otherwise, we'll dispose of that item with a vote as well. Seeing no hands raised, is there a motion to recommend adoption? Alder Furman, go ahead, please.
Sure. So I would be recommending adoption of items 5 and 6, which are Legislar items 69379 and 69380, both having to do with roadway cafe permit and street cafe and roadway cafe expansion.
Thank you, Alder Furman. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Alder Foster. Thank you. Any further discussion? All right, on the motion then for Legislar 69379, recommend adoption, creating section 10.03 of 10.30 of the Madison General Ordinances to create the roadway cafe permit to allow for the expansion of licensed sidewalk cafes into the roadway and amending sections 12.1425, 38.05 3E1, and 1.083A accordingly, and 1.084 accordingly, and Legislar 69380, recommending adoption for creating section 9.135 sidewalk cafe and roadway cafe expansion licenses to create a new roadway cafe expansion license and make the streetery program for sidewalk cafes permanent, creating section 9.136 street vending on the State Street Mall Capitol Concourse, repealing section 9.13 license for selling on public streets, and recreating section 9.13 as street vending licenses, and amending sections 9.12, 1.083A, and 1.084 accordingly. All those in favor, please unmute yourselves and say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Chair believes it's unanimous. If you'd like to register a no vote, please raise your hand. Seeing no hands raised, those will go down as unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Megan. All right, then our last item for the evening is Legislar 66898, complete screen streets, update on Let's Talk Streets.
All right. So we have with us tonight, besides myself, Renee Calloway, head bike administrator, for those of you who haven't met me, and Philip Gritzmacher. We've also been joined the work since he started on staff. But we are joined by our consultants from Tool Design, Adam Wood and Sonia Heichel, who've been here before working on this project, as well as Annette Miller and Myra Medrano from Equity by Design, who've really been working hard with us on this project and particularly focused on the engagement piece. And what we want to do here is answer some questions that came up at the last meeting so that we can circle back to those before we move on to some of the new items we'll be working on. And so I think unless Tom or Yang has anything to add, I'll just turn it over so that we can jump in and use our time efficiently to get some good discussion and feedback from you. No. All right, looks like we can jump in.
Okay. If I can get Zoom to work. Maybe it's my mouse that's not working. I'm sorry.
All these months, and yet we still have all these little technology things. Essentially, it's like you go and then it has to update Zoom immediately.
It updated and it changed my share options. I can't share a screen. I can only share an application. Let's see if this works then.
There we go.
Okay. Great. All right. Well, sorry about that. I had Zoom problems and my mouse died at the same moment. So that's great timing on things. Well, good evening, everyone. Good to be back to talk about the Complete Green Streets project in the Let's Talk Streets umbrella of public engagement that we went through over the past year. I want to start out, and I know this slide deck was in the packet, so hopefully some of you have had a chance to look through it, but I wanted to start out by just doing a quick recap of what is the purpose of Complete Green Streets, why are we doing this. The bullet list on the left really encompasses that, the various aspects of this, but we're essentially trying to streamline decision making and make sure that the outcomes of our street projects are more consistently getting us to the types of future that we want to have in the city, the types of options for places to walk and bike safely, supporting transit, supporting new development and neighborhoods and so forth. The tool that we're working on, that we're building, will help to define the priorities within different types of street projects and identify, where are the areas of flexibility, where are things that should be more of a line in the sand, if you will, in terms of design elements. With the overall goal of increasing equity on our streets, increasing safety, and overall helping to promote the values of the community and create connected networks. So this evening, there are 6 main pieces on the within our slideshow. We're going to start off by giving a bit of a recap on the values and the modal hierarchy and talking about some additional survey results. And then we'll get into a presentation of the proposed equity framework, talk a little bit about how everything is starting to come together into a decision-making process. And then we'll drill down into 3 of the main overlays within the complete green streets: the equity priority areas, transit priority network, and bike priority network. So starting off with the values and the modal hierarchy. This is a slide that we have presented before, but it's just sort of an all-encompassing kind of a philosophical slide, if you will, about Let's Talk Streets and how that informs the complete green streets project. With the Let's Talk Streets public outreach campaign, we really asked this fundamental question about what would we do if we changed how we think about streets. At the beginning of this meeting, Tom talked about some of the changing dynamics and how our streets are being used today, different traffic patterns and so forth, and that plays into this conversation as well. And I want to recap or reiterate that when we talk about a street, we're not just talking about the roadway, we're talking about the sidewalks and the terraces and really everything within the right-of-way. During the engagement process, we heard and really discerned 4 values from the community, and we tested that through the survey, and they're shown there in the bullet list with some lighter purple sort of examples of how those values are being translated into more direct decision-making elements within complete green streets. And then, of course, the modal hierarchy, which is shown on the right. We presented this preliminary modal hierarchy in the survey that was held last year online, and asked people if they looked at this hierarchy, if this was adopted, and that if people knew that this would increase safety and equity and sustainability, could you live with it? The results are shown on the slide, and generally speaking, it was pretty positive support overall. Either people that strongly supported it or people that said they could live with it. In the focused engagement we had with communities and population groups that have historically been underrepresented in engagement, we also heard a strong degree of support for this preliminary modal hierarchy. The question was raised for the people that said they couldn't live with it, and maybe some of the people that said they could live with it, but maybe they weren't strongly supportive. What was their rationale, or sort of what were the things that they would have changed? One of the questions in the survey did say, if you answered no, could you please share why you could not live with it? Now, if someone said that they could live with it, they were still allowed to answer this question, so there's some of that thrown into the mix as well. This is just kind of a word cloud of some of the key themes that came out of that, or some of the recurring phrases, rather. And we worked, and this is really Annette and her team at Equity by Design, worked through these comments and created themes from them. The next 2 slides have some of the comments written out, so you can see the nature of them. I'm not going to read through them all. But what I'll say is there were really 3 primary themes that came from that. The biggest one of which was prioritizing on-street parking. And reading through some of these comments, it seems that some of the people that were making these comments were under the impression that the hierarchy would mean on-street parking would be removed from the majority of streets, which is really not the intent of the modal hierarchy. And I think that lesson learned there is we could have done a better job of sort of explaining how the hierarchy could work in some of those instances. I think that the majority of streets that have on-street parking today will retain the on-street parking, especially when we're talking about neighborhood streets. And a lot of these do talk about neighborhood parking. So that was the biggest group at 57%. There was another common theme with that was more of a pro-business or business support type of theme. But when you get into the meat of those comments, again, it has to do primarily with parking in front of businesses. And you can see that that's been highlighted on these slides, kind of in that orange color. And then there was a group that was also 14% of those 108 open-ended responses that wanted to see biking prioritized above transit in the hierarchy. So out of the 200 or so total responses to the survey, 108 people offered a written response to this question, and 14% of the 108 wanted more, had that pro-business slant, another 14% had the prioritizing bikes slant, and then another had the on-street parking, primarily again in neighborhoods. So as I said, I'm not going to read through these all, but wanted to put them in there for you to have a read and get a sense for some of the nature of the comments that came from that. One of the things we did in the survey, and this was actually before we showed that proposed hierarchy, we had an activity or had a question where we asked people to drag and drop to rank these different modes in the order in which they would prioritize them if they were wanting to prioritize different modes. Just to explain this chart, you can see there's 6 colors within it. The dark blue indicates the number of people that chose that as their number one top of the list when they were ranking things. So the long dark blue line at the top, which is people walking or using a wheelchair, indicated that really a vast majority of people taking the survey put walking or using a wheelchair at the top. They ranked that number one. The next color, this sort of light blue, is indicating people that rank number 2. So the biggest number 2 was people biking. The light blue or kind of gray was number 3. The biggest number 3 was people using transit, and then so on and so forth. And we sort of divided the lines or divided the groupings, the top 3 and bottom 3. So the yellow, kind of orange and red are people that rank things toward the bottom. So when you total up the top 3 rankings for the different modes, walking is certainly at the top. It was at the top based on the number 1 as well, but transit comes up pretty highly as well. When you look at the bottom rankings, that's where you see some, smaller numbers of people thought that walking and transit and biking should be at the bottom of the list. But there was a larger proportion of respondents putting biking lower down on the list than transit. So all that to say, we feel like this really supports and the survey overall really supports that preliminary proposed hierarchy, which we're now, really calling the proposed hierarchy, which is putting walking and then transit and then biking in that order. So that's kind of an answer to the question of what, for the people that said they couldn't live with it, what were their results or their sort of rationales rather. And it really was largely a parking thing was where most of those comments came from. I think what this indicates is that while more people put biking number 2 on their list than transit, when asked the question of could you live with this other option, generally people were supportive enough, and there was only, again, 14% of the 108, which is roughly 7% of the total survey respondents, that really said they had a problem with it, that were looking at it from a biking versus transit perspective. So I'm going to slide into the next section then, which is looking at the equity framework. And I'm going to primarily speak through this, but I want to make sure to point out that Equity by Design and Annette Miller are really instrumental in creating this element, and we've worked really closely together on it. When we talk about an equity framework for this project, it's important for us to think about what is it that we're trying to address. And if you recall early on, we talked about some of the disparities that we see in our transportation system and on our streets. Things like access to job and opportunities, the sort of realities of residential segregation that we still sort of have by de facto of where people live. And that ties in with proximity to transit being disparities, level of investment in neighborhoods where sidewalk gaps exist, pavement conditions, so forth. Safety is also a really big thing. We've shown you a similar graphic to this in the past. This is a newer graphic that I thought kind of illustrated the point a little bit more clearly, which is that fatalities really impact people in different communities, different race and ethnic communities differently. The top set of bars is all crashes, and the bottom set of bars are crashes involving pedestrians. You can see that especially the indigenous or Native American, American Indian population has the greatest level of risk, disproportionate risk of the population shown. Now, these are national statistics, but some preliminary work in the city's Vision Zero report indicates some similar trends. I know this is probably a little hard to see, but the bars on the left of each of these four graphs represents the Black or African American population in Madison, and you can see again the disparities that exist there. So, that's kind of why we're looking at this. This is another chart that we showed previously, just as a reminder about some of the disparities in terms of where people live relative to various transportation elements. And you can see highlighted in the purple that especially if you're Black, if you're African American, if you're Hispanic, Latino, that you are especially more likely or less likely, depending on how you look at it, to live near a high injury network, to be near a gap in a sidewalk network, to not be as close to high frequency transit, and so on and so forth. So we've shown you this sort of spheres of inequity diagram before, and it's just a reminder that Complete Green Streets is part of a whole lot of stuff that's going on, a whole lot of things that intersect and play out. So one street project is not going to solve equity. It's not going to solve problems, but it does have a really important role to play. One of the things that is new on this slide is this equity definition, and that's essentially that somebody's various characteristics of their identity does not predict their safety outcomes, their travel opportunities, or access to jobs and opportunities. Is really what we're looking forward to in the future, and we're trying to create through the equity framework. So I realize this slide has a whole lot of words on it, so I'm going to actually skip to just a zoom in of this diagram. I wanted to include that slide so if you were able to review the packet in advance, you could kind of read through some of that. But this is essentially an overview of the equity framework that has been developed through this project. And there's kind of four main pieces to this. The green is that all street projects through this Complete Green Streets model will help to advance equity in Madison. And there's kind of two main pieces to that. One is inherently by making streets safer, by focusing on increasing access, and by making it easier and safer to walk and bike and use transit. That's a way we can move toward equity. Also on each individual project, a demographic assessment of who lives near the corridor should be performed so that if there are impacts that are happening on one portion of the street project and not on another, we're not putting those impacts on people of color or on people with low incomes. So, for example, let's talk about a street where there's on-street parking, and maybe the on-street parking should be removed for a portion. We don't have to remove it from the whole street, but for a portion. If most of the street is single-family houses with driveways, but one portion is an apartment complex with people with lower income live there and they don't have off-street parking, let's not remove the parking just from in front of that apartment complex, because that would have a disproportionate impact on a population that may have cars that may not have their own dedicated parking. That's just one example, one hypothetical of how that could play out. So taking a step forward, this EPA acronym, not the Environmental Protection Agency, but this is the Equity Priority Area, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There are some locations within the city, and if a project is located near or in one of these equity priority areas, it will have an impact on the prioritization of some of the street elements and some of the decision making. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. So that's for ones that are in or near. And then if it is in the equity priority area, that also triggers a coordination process whereby the city should, as the transportation department is coming in to look at a street project, look at what else is happening in that area, what other needs and issues have been identified. And it's really a staff coordination effort then to make sure that you're not sort of working in a vacuum when there are a lot of intersectional, no pun intended, I know we're working on a street project here, but there's a lot of intersectional issues at play. And simply going in and working on a street project without taking that into consideration can have the unintended consequence of actually exacerbating some of the problems or some of the lack of investment challenges that have arisen through that. So that's an overview of the equity framework. I did want to give Annette a chance to chime in if there was anything burning that you wanted to say that I missed there. Good. Okay. All right. Moving forward then. The decision-making process. So this is an indicator. This is an overview of how everything is shaping up. We're not showing you everything tonight. There's a lot of stuff. This is a really complex tool overall. We have worked hard to try to simplify and clarify it as best we can. But this is kind of the crux of how everything comes together. And it's really a 4-step decision-making process. And I'll say that this process is intended to take that hierarchy, to take those values and say, here's how you can put it to work. Here's how you can integrate it into a real project. It takes into account context, and it takes into account that there are streets that have different, or there are modes rather that have needs of different streets. So the first step is identifying the street type. We have shown you this chart before, and we've talked about the 11 street types that comprise the typology that has been developed. And these really reflect the spectrum of current and future types of streets in Madison. And each one of these is intended to serve as a flexible starting point for street design to sort of say, here's the intent, here's the idea. There's places where we can shift here and there, take in or add in, take out sort of stuff. But here's the starting point. And they're rooted in context. So you can kind of see the shifting in colors, and the left is more urban and mixed use, and the right is lower density and more residential. So that's step one, is identifying that. And I will go back and say, we are mapping, and this will be something we show you in a future meeting with you. We are mapping out most of the top 6 that are shown there. Some of these on the that next to bottom level will also be mapped out as well. So this is going to be sort of some work that's already done, but it's looking at what is that type of street and then identifying the overlays. There are 6 overlays, and we're going to talk about the 3 that are in orange in a little bit more detail. These include both network overlays, so corridors, street corridors, and then areas that are more zones. The canopy priority areas and the distributed green infrastructure priority areas are not shown. That's still a work in progress that is going to require additional work and coordination with various interdepartmental considerations at play there. So you identify the street type, you identify the overlay. Okay, here's where things start to look very complicated, but I promise you this is a simplified version of what this could have been. The third step then is to understand what are the priorities for the street and what are the types of things that we should include. Each of the street types is going to include a table like the one shown here. And I don't want you to get too in the weeds reading the text. This is kind of intended to be a bit more of a mock-up to sort of show you what it'll look like. The table will identify what typically are we going to put in this street and what's the relative priority between these elements. You can see the color coding on here with the purple is walkway. That's basically the sidewalk and whatever happens between the sidewalk and the building. The green is the flex zone, the terrace and on-street parking. And then that sort of orangey, pinky color is the travelway. Gray can take into consideration other pieces like intersection spacing and crossing and so forth. So it's kind of identifying what happens in these different zones within the street cross-section. And if there is an overlay, as you can see kind of moving down the rows, how does that change those typical elements? Now, the overlays are listed in a level of hierarchy that really relates to and copies or mimics rather the modal hierarchy that we showed earlier, and I'll show you another example of that in a minute. So what happens if you have multiple overlays, multiple, you say it's both transit priority network and bike priority network? Well, you use the hierarchy to sort of work your way down the list. You say if it's an equity priority area, these are the types of things we need to make sure we include. If it's also a transit priority area, let's try to fit these things in as well. And you kind of go down the list trying to work everything in. And you may be able to do a great job and get in everything you want. The reality is the step 4 is that most street projects, especially for reconstructing or repaving an existing street, there's going to be constraint. There's going to have to be some type of trade-off made. And that's where there's kind of 2 pieces to this. One is a priority identified for each of the zones. So if you look at this sort of the darker shaded row, the high priority, medium priority, so forth, it tells you where would you take away first. So in this particular instance, the flex zone is medium priority. The walkway and the travelway are both high priority. So you take away from the flex zone first. That's where you'd start trying to shave space. Besides that, you get down into the rows, and the intent here and sort of what we've been mocking up so far is to actually provide some kind of narrative guidance in those situations. If you can't fit in both X and Y, in this type of situation, X would have the priority. So it's a little bit less of a rigid and prescriptive calculator, if you will, of what the street will look like, but it's a context and situation-based guidance that will help, again, to kind of streamline and increase consistency of the designs that come out of this process. Okay, so now popping into the particulars of the 3 that we wanted to show you tonight. I'll show you again, 6 overlays. Half of them are networks and half of them are areas. And there's a hierarchy established. And again, this hierarchy mimics the overall modal hierarchy. The difference is we've added in the equity priority areas, canopy priority areas, and the distributed green infrastructure priority areas. We put the equity priority area on top, again, based on those values of centering equity in the project. That's why that comes up first. The canopy and DGI both have an asterisk next to them, and that's because that's still a work in progress, and we need to really think about the role of streets and the role of street right-of-way in both of those systems. So that could flip-flop depending on how things go with some of the technical analysis and thinking about where the needs really are. So the equity priority areas, I'm going to do this for these 3. I'm going to tell you sort of what it's based on, what it might do, and show you a map. We based this on the neighborhood resource team focus areas, and then added some additional areas onto them based on racial and income demographics. I already talked about the different ways that this will have an influence, but I'll get into some of the specifics, which is some of the design changes. This is, again, to be determined as we work through developing those tables I showed just a second ago. But we're expecting it to do things like decreasing the spacing of street crossings, so you have more safe and comfortable opportunities to get across the street, prioritizing the width of sidewalks over the number and width of travel lanes, things along those lines. So here's a map of the locations. Again, if you are familiar with the neighborhood resource team focus areas, this map probably looks pretty familiar to you. You might, those of you with eagle eyes might pick out a few of the small additions that were made. Largely, again, based on income and ethnic and racial demographics. So we included a few places with some subsidized public housing in it. We added, places where there are higher densities of people under certain income thresholds and with certain racial and ethnic demographic characteristics to try to encompass some areas that had not yet become part of the neighborhood resource team program. On the transit priority network front, this is entirely based on the Metro Transit Network redesign, the proposed network. So the intent, and this is the purple text at the bottom, the intent is that future changes to the transit network and the plan that they have, say 10, 15, 20, however far in the future, should trigger changes to the transit priority network in complete green streets. So if 3 months from now, one of these lines is moved, it should move in complete green streets as well. It is based on the higher frequency transit network, so looking at any street with a bus every 30 minutes or less on it. And it influences in sort of potentially several ways, and we've broken this down into an always and a maybe, essentially. The always piece of this is that whenever you're approaching one of these streets and designing, you need to look at what is going to maximize the efficiency of the transit operation. And the maximizing the safe and comfortable access to transit for people walking, essentially accessing those transit stops. That may not mean any noticeable changes to the street, but it's considering what are those different potential impacts, what are those things that could create limitations for transit, and addressing those and trying to eliminate those negative impacts that might happen. That said, it could trigger some things like removing parking, providing dedicated transit lanes. Those may be places where you want to do signal preemption or enhanced transit stops, things along those lines. And then maybe some things that speeds up boarding, but might impact traffic flow. So one of the examples, a bus pullout. The bus pulls out of the flow of traffic for boarding, so it's not blocking the car traffic. Well, sometimes it's hard for the bus to get back in the stream of traffic. And so the bus riders are sitting there and they're waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting. And that's slowing down the bus traffic. That's the sort of situation we don't want to have happen. So maybe the bus actually stops and it blocks the lane of traffic while it's boarding and alighting. That's an operational issue. I think that's something to think about and consider, and it's going to be a case-by-case basis type of decision, but that's one place where you might choose to go that route. And then, as I mentioned earlier, making sure that you can get across the street, you can get to this transit stuff and everything is going to be paramount on these transit priority network streets. So here's a map. This doesn't look a whole lot different than the Metro redesign map as it stands today. We've included the draft equity priority areas on this map as well, so you can see the relationship between those zones. Again, the selection of these routes is really based on the on Metro's network as it's planned. And then the third is the bike priority network. And, we've again got a couple things highlighted in color because we want to make sure it stands out. And the first is similar to the transit priority network. Future changes to the bike plan should trigger changes to the bike priority network. This project is really meant to help design streets, shape street design to support the planning effort that's happening around the transportation system, not to be a transportation plan in and of itself. The second thing I want to point out is that this is not at all intended to say that these are the only streets where bikes should be prioritized. The modal hierarchy still applies. So any street that does not have transit is going to be walking, biking, driving, and so on and so forth. What this is, again, it's based on the 2015 bike plan with the primary bikeways and some additions to close gaps and ensure we have connections, because if you only look at the primary bikeways on the map, there are some gaps there. And this really, we're seeing this as being streets that should be considered critical to creating a complete network and really focusing on creating all ages and abilities network for those streets. And again, we've got there in quotes, the line in the stand sort of thing when it comes to trade-offs. So that's kind of how to think about this relative to any other street where we still might prioritize biking. These are the ones where it's sort of like, we're absolutely going to make sure it happens here. This could have a variety of impacts, but it could include things like taking on-street parking off in order to provide the bikeway. Again, this would be on a select number of streets, not every street in the city. It might entail creating a bike boulevard by diverting traffic. So that's another place where that trade-off might play out. So I know there are a lot of lines on this map, so it may take a bit to digest. There were also PDFs that were put in Legistar, both this map and a map showing the transit priority networks. This shows in the darker green the bike priority network pieces, and the lighter green are secondary bikeways in the plan. And we're showing that because the secondary bikeways help to illustrate some of the connectivity that is created. We've intentionally not differentiated between path and street on this map because we're just trying to get the dark green to show an overall level of network connectivity. So kind of at the end of what we wanted to share with you and wanted to put this below the list up here, and I'm happy to flip back in slides if there are any thoughts or questions, but sort of what we're hoping to get from you for everything we showed tonight, all three of these overlays, we would love to just get your thoughts or questions about this as a concept in general, the big picture of what we have. The larger PDF maps are online. If you do have more detailed comments, you can record those on a PDF or written or something along those lines and send them to Renee Calloway for processing and translating over to us. Specifically on the equity priority areas, we just want to know how this resonates, especially any of you that have kind of thought through some of these things and thought about how equity relates to our transportation system. Does this approach, both in terms of the areas, but also the process, seem fair and equitable? Does it make sense to you? On the transit priority side, we're really basing the identification of the priority network on headways, and we're just sort of wanting to know, does it feel right to base things on headways? Does it strike the right balance? And then on the bike priority network front, this is not intended to be a bike planning effort, but we do understand that this is an area of interest for a lot of people, and there could be a lot of interest in this map and, identifying additions or changes or what have you. And we're curious as a board what your thoughts are in terms of how much engagement or what type of engagement should we have around this particular map, and what outcomes might we hope to get from it, or what outcomes might be, say this would be better for a future process to look at an update to the bike plan map. I do have, some slides about next steps that we could talk through in any further detail, but these are some of the things that are coming up down the line. More discussion about overlays. We're anticipating some of the stuff we talked about tonight. Illustrations of what these different zones. I talked about the flex zone and the walkway, and I know it's a lot of information, but some illustrations to show you more of what that means. And then the actual elements for the table, typical elements tables, for the typology for each of the street types, showing those to you, getting feedback and so forth. We're making progress on the green infrastructure scope side of things. And once we get through sort of that list on the left with you, we'll then look at our next stage of engagement and figure out what's the best way for us to get feedback from the broader community on that. And that is the end of our presentation.
All right, thank you, Adam. We do have one registrant for public comment, a Kristen Slack. If we could get Kristen unmuted. Kristen, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You've got 3 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Okay. So focusing on this initiative's title, I searched the presentation submitted for this agenda item. I was really surprised to see that the word environment never appears. Madison has a long and rich history of environmental activism. Also, one of Madison's signature characteristics is its bodies of water. These priorities do not appear in any meaningful way in the Green Streets Initiative material. Reducing environmental harm should be a priority on par with the others that have been listed, so it gets elevated as such and given careful and deliberate consideration. In the city's own Let's Talk Streets community survey, 87% of respondents agreed that fostering sustainability, defined in part as using streets to expand the urban tree canopy and clean stormwater, was important. In fact, it achieved the highest level of agreement of any value asked about in the survey. But this definition is not evident in what is being proposed to the city. There's not even a layer in the proposed model graphic that depicts trees and water. Madison should be a leader in prioritizing environmental protections. This should not be considered a lesser concern than other priorities. Context is also important. National data or survey results that present answers to questions asked outside of the context in which specific projects are happening are not sufficient and often aren't even relevant. The City of Madison does not have infinite resources. Our leaders are charged with being good stewards of these resources, not the least of which is taxpayer money. Including elements, especially expensive ones, in projects where the need for these elements is low relative to other geographic areas where need is high is not fiscally responsible, and it also exacerbates inequities on a broader scale, given finite city resources. Access and equity are empty words if you don't take steps to engage the very people you are claiming to stand for in the contexts where they live their lives. In the Design Engagement Interim Report, centering equity is defined as both outcomes and process. Efforts were made to solicit community input on the model being proposed in a more general way, which I really appreciated seeing. This approach should actually be a requirement in each individual project, and it needs to begin at project conception. Community engagement is merely performative when it happens after planning begins or after the city has already decided on a top-down approach. This leaves people feeling powerless, stressed, and it sets up an adversarial situation. There's a much better way, but it requires extra work, resources, and time upfront and throughout the life of each project to engage with residents and stakeholders and listen to and seriously consider their needs, concerns, and ideas. This creates project buy-in and support from residents. There could be some truly amazing projects that emerge from extending the EQT by design approach to each individual project, things that could set the standard around the country and that could be a source of pride not only for the city, but for the residents they impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Are there any questions for our registrant? Right, seeing none. Thank you again. Questions for Adam? Comments, discussion? Chris, go ahead, please.
Thanks. I would just say, big picture, this is really neat the way it's coming together. It seems like a lot of the questions that we raised last time, there seem to be some elegant ways of working through some of these tough decisions. And I can see how it's starting to make sense in the process. I think sitting with it a little more will start to gel more and more. One question I have, and I think it speaks a little bit to the commenter's question that we just heard. In the equity priority areas, it sounds like, I think I heard you say two things. One is that there will be kind of sort of prescribed decision rules, when it comes to an equity priority area, but also a higher level of public engagement. Is that right? And I have a follow-up if I'm hearing that right.
I'd say yes, that's right. I would also invite Annette to weigh in on that as the genius behind the idea.
Thanks, Adam. So I guess my take on it is it's to create more coordination, especially this is more behind the scenes within the city. If you recall the diagram, the different concentric circles, one of the things that we're really trying to push is to make sure that when we are doing street redesign, we're also complementing and coordinating what else is happening in the city, because that's where we can get real equity impact and equity gains in terms of some of the things that we've heard when we did engagement in terms of what people are distressed about. So it's not so much as it's more engagement, it's more about demonstrating that the city is listening and actually trying to solve some of the things that have been expressed by the community as to what's been inequitable in terms of their experiences, particularly in those equity priority areas.
Okay, thanks. So what happens if the main interest being expressed in an equity priority area bucks the whole hierarchy? Like, for example, parking is the number one priority.
I think that I think it's important to listen and understand the reasons for some of the requests and to take them into consideration. We certainly want to use data when we're making decisions, but data does not always capture all of the ways that people use their space and the needs that people have. So I think one of the key things to take away from this is that it's not a calculator. It's not going to generate like the one true answer, that there's only one way to approach things. It's going to say, here are the elements that are high priorities. And to the degree that you can incorporate the priorities based on the modal networks and the street type and so forth, while also handling the requests, like that would be great if you could make that happen. If the community desire is divergent from the priorities identified for the street type or for the modal network, I think that's where things become more challenging. What I would say is those challenges likely happen today, and they would happen with or without this. And this at least helps to give you a framework with which to make those decisions and weigh those trade-offs and decide, how do we go? How do we move forward? Do we hear this and we find a new route for whatever modal priority it is, or do we look at handling the answer in some other way? If it's on-street parking, is there a way to increase the on-street parking on the perpendicular side streets or something along those lines to try to address the issue?
And I would just add by saying that, the purpose of the design of this is to create and make more visible where, the hot spots are in terms of the discussion, so that you can have a conversation. It doesn't mean that it's going to this doesn't solve it, but it at least gets it on the table so that it can be discussed. And sometimes when you're able to discuss it and start talking about the trade-offs and thinking about, what happens, if you do this versus something else, you can actually get agreement. You can get to a compromise, and you can get to an agreement that wasn't there if you never acknowledged that it was exacerbating or causing more harm. Do you know what I'm saying? Usually it doesn't even get discussed. But this way you can at least you can ensure that the conversation is happening. You're inviting the people to the table to have the conversation, and you can also invite people to talk about what might be some other ways in which you can address it versus not even having it or not even recognizing it at all. So I want to bring that up to say that is part of what can help address these conversations, especially around inequity, is that usually you don't even have the conversation. This allows for the conversation to happen, and it also allows for the different stakeholders who may not be on the same page about what they think needs to happen. You can get them to perhaps come to some different ways in which they would feel they could live with it, is the term that I like to say. They could live with it, having a better understanding of what would happen if you choose a different approach.
Thanks. I sense your your difficulty in trying to answer this question because it's a hard one. I think we are already having some of those conversations, and I'm not seeing yet how this gets us to a better place. So I'm thinking about that and trying to wrestle with that in my mind. Second question I had is okay. So this has actually come up recently. A Transportation Commission about roads in new areas, completely new developments, typically residential areas, where the trade-offs don't really have to do with space limitations. Like we could build as big of a road as we want and fit everything in, but then we have too big of a road. So I think what folks in city staff and Transportation Commission and elsewhere are going to be looking for is like, what are the appropriate templates to achieve the right balance? Do you see this getting us there?
I think it certainly can. I would say that those decisions are not the sticky decisions that a street in an existing developed area tends to be, where every context really is unique. What we are envisioning having is a series of really technical parameters tables that indicate things like lane widths and configuration and that sort of thing to be a complement to this. It's almost more appendix material, because the meat of this is really sort of like, what are we going to typically put in and how do we make the determination between, how do we weigh the trade-offs? But those types of parameters can be included in the back.
Great, thanks. I guess one last point of feedback on the transit priority areas. I think frequency is probably the right way to go. It feels like that's the way we're going to start talking about routes anyway. So that seems good. Thanks.
Yang, is your hand up in relation to one of Chris's questions, or otherwise we'll go Dollar Foster first? Just checking.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Yes, I just want to add a little bit to Chris' last question. This example did come up at the last Transportation Commission meeting, and it's a new area and with new streets proposed. So when the space is not quite limited, how can we make sure the street we design fits a context and not being too big a street with parking not being utilized, ending up leading traffic coming right after the street is built. So that's definitely some good point. I think Adam gave some really good answers, and I also want to add that we also have some typical cross sections for each type of streets to go with this. So that hopefully that help us define. Really, we don't have to keep, for New Street, we don't have to serve everything in there, and we still have some examples to go by. So I think, definitely we should probably do more work on that. As I think there are obviously different demands, and we may not exactly know what a street will end up look like and what development end up look like, but that may give us some tool to use. So obviously we still have some work to do on that. Not just the company green streets team, but also the development review team. But that's great. That's a great point. Thank you, Chair.
Yang, Alder Foster, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I would echo a lot of Chris's comments. I think there's some really good work at starting to kind of fit together in a logical way. I also need a little bit more time to sit on it and kind of think through it. This last comment about sort of a template for new streets, I actually think it is super important. We're seeing these at Board of Public Works come through, and we are making tomorrow's mistakes today with those. And it is a real issue because it's a completely different process from what's the available width and then what are the priorities. And we just start allocating it and kind of, there's no more room left. When we don't have that constraint, it really causes problems. So we end up generally creating these over wide streets, parking on both sides when it's a low density residential neighborhood. So I do hope that we really take that one on seriously. I know engineering is also really interested in wanting to have better and clear guidance and templates on those, because we actually have ordinances that require minimum widths today that are, in my opinion, just inappropriate. But on the equity framework, I had kind of a similar question also from Chris. I mean, I think the language that I saw in there was changes to priority of street elements. So my big concern on that one is, I think similarly, does this end up leading to, okay, well, here's our framework, here's what we normally do, but we heard from a neighborhood meeting, people were really worried about losing on-street parking. And now we kind of throw this out the window and we say, well, it's an equity area. So, we heard from the 6 people that were at this meeting, and that's kind of the direction we have to go. And so I know that's probably not the goal, but it's my sort of concern of just knowing, I mean, in my mind, this work is supposed to be this framework, this kind of slow thinking framework where we really figure out, yep, there's a reason we're kind of going in these paths. and we're building this to resist some of that kind of, I think we're expecting to get pushed back on any project when we try and make some changes to how things are today versus how we want to go. And I worry that, if you have 60 or 70% of people who are primarily driving and mostly interested in access for driving and parking their cars, that dynamic doesn't necessarily shift that much if it's an equity priority area or not. And so I'm wondering how we can build some resiliency into this so that doesn't happen. And I think what I heard from Annette, most resonated with me is, if anything, the equity priority areas to me seems like our opportunity to really invest on that engagement side, on more conversations, longer conversations, more background information. That seems like a really good investment for those areas, more than maybe the kind of the general priorities that have all been established in the thing are sort of more up for debate. So I don't know if there's any reactions to that or thoughts that you could go into. The only example I saw in the presentation was maybe more space for walking, which that sounds good and sounds consistent with the overall priorities. So what's another example of how we would change our thinking based on an equity priority area?
Yeah, I think, to the question about what if everyone says they need parking, I think what that really should do is it should trigger an assessment. And I think what as you just said about an opportunity to invest more time into engaging and understanding, I think that should trigger looking at what is there a parking issue? Did we, maybe it's an older area where there were no minimum parking requirements, no parking requirements at all. And there really is a lack of available parking. And if that's the case, maybe find solutions for it. And again, maybe it's not on that particular street. Maybe it's look for another option. Maybe it's get creative and buy an empty lot and put a parking lot in it or something. It could be one approach that could be taken. I don't think that it should just necessarily be, as you say, 6 people show up to a meeting and they say they want this. And so we throw, our principles out the window to do that. But it's, maybe thinking a little bit more critically and taking that opportunity to investigate what are some of the challenges in the neighborhood would be a key piece of it. I think, some of the things that we heard through the focused engagement were about connectivity and access and getting in and out of neighborhoods. And so I think one of the things really is about crossings, is about providing and really crossings, controlled ways to get out of the neighborhood, even in your car. If you think about some neighborhoods like Darbo Worthington, where there's one way in, one way out, that's actually fully controlled. It's a really difficult neighborhood to access. That's where we may say, okay, we would normally not put a signal every 300 feet on a street like this, but perhaps we do need to have more closely spaced signals, and maybe we need to invest in, I'm not a traffic engineer. I forget the term. Signals that talk to each other, dynamic signals that can talk to each other, so that we don't create gridlock, but we can put an extra investment in here to address this issue that's created by the freeways that were built around it in the past, by all these sorts of compounding things that happened to create some of the challenges that are there today.
And also I was going to add to that, also what was brought up in those focused conversations is that you come in, you work on a street, but for the people who are living there, there are other intersecting streets, there's potholes, there's the way people are crossing, there's lighting, there's, the way they get dropped off by transit, inability to cross safely. There's all these other issues. And so there was this deeper conversation around equity that I think had wider reaching impact in terms of people's quality of life that some of this work is getting to. And so it wasn't a single issue of that's sort of being used as an example here. So I think that was part of my pause, is that it's more intersected than that, is how can the people living in a neighborhood that is considered an equity priority area, if there's street work and redesign work being done, that the focus isn't so narrow. It is thinking about the safety, of how people go to work, of how people get to the businesses that are nearby, that there's just this bigger conversation that occurs, and that there's actually bigger change that happens as a result of coming in and doing street redesign. So that's kind of sort of how those were some of the things that we heard. And then obviously there was some conversation around policies, in terms of fines and things like that. So it's a layered conversation when we're talking about equity. And it isn't about more talking. It's about action and results on some of the things that have been an issue in some of these priority areas. And when we're doing street redesign, we sort of connect the dots and we leverage the moment to have a bigger impact in terms of how we can make change. So that those streets look more consistent with some of the other streets in other neighborhoods around Madison. So I'll think more about the questions that you're asking good questions, and I can get some more information to speak more directly to it.
I think that what you just said resonated a lot with me, and I almost wonder if there's not a place to what does complete streets mean in our equity priority areas? Well, it means understand that complete streets is even more than complete, meaning all the modes, but it's all of these other things, right, that have maybe historically been missing. And so bringing additional resources to bear, having other agencies at those meetings, right, anticipating, expecting, allowing, and supporting those conversations that go beyond traffic, right? That resonates with me a ton. And would, that seems like a really great way to say, what does it mean when we're dealing with projects within these areas? So yeah, maybe fleshing that out a little bit. I think that would be great. And then just maybe kind of taking another look at that language around changing the priority of street elements. I think if that's something that we do want to consider, we should, let's think on that one really hard. I just want to be really wary of sort of opening up that kind of Pandora's box door of, in some areas, these are our priorities and some aren't. I think there's a way to navigate that, with integrity, but I really appreciate what you were just saying on that. And I think if you could flesh that out, it would be great to integrate in here.
It's illuminated on, if you look at slides 16 and 17, that's the spheres. That's what that's speaking to. And what we're trying to do is get that, if we're working on, for example, if it's a complete streets project, green streets project, what else, how is that connected to what else might be going on in the Department of Transportation, for example, right? There does need to be an analysis that actually, it gets really nerdy, and it really is behind the scenes. It's not so much a public facing process as it is a behind the scenes. The staff is really looking at, okay, if we're going in if the Green Streets project has us going over here, how can we leverage what else we have as the city to address those broader issues that residents are speaking about, and particularly when we talk about bringing more resources to the table. So yes, it's on those particular slides, and yes, we can work at trying to delineate that a little bit more clearly. We drink this all the time, so for us it's like, what, you don't see it?
Yeah, I would not assume that folks are going to get all that out of the concentric circles. So definitely, in my opinion, would be worth getting a little bit more clear on that, because I think there would be a lot of support for it, and I think it could do the most to actually accomplish what we're trying to do. I did have a couple other questions. I don't know if Alder Harrington McKinney, if you were wanting to comment now or.
No, why don't you go ahead and complete?
Okay, thank you. I guess just the last thing on the equity framework that I was thinking about is this, it was kind of addressed in the, like, is it, near an equity priority area or in, et cetera. So one thing that I think there's a little bit of risk of losing is kind of overall network connectivity for equity priority areas, which sometimes have really significant impacts on missing connections, et cetera, that aren't right in or even directly adjacent to. So at some point, kind of doing a almost like an access, we did this a fair amount with or we're doing it right now with the transit. But I think similarly for, let's say, bike network, it's not just like, is there a bike lane, or route in this area or even right next to it, but what does it connect to, right? And if for folks that live in this area, what's their access by bike via the current network? And it might signal some priority gaps or things that need to be improved that are down the line somewhere that aren't necessarily right in that neighborhood. So I think just maybe giving a little bit more thought on that one is, for stuff that's happening in the neighborhood, it's probably a lot about how do we minimize some of the harms of traffic, et cetera, have more space for being, for living, for walking, et cetera. But then also let's not lose sight of the kind of overall access that might run into issues a little bit further outside of the direct neighborhood. One question I had on, and Adam, I don't know on that, I think it's that step 4 slide where you were kind of showing how this actually would start to play out, just kind of the broader overlays. At least one you had up, and I don't know, maybe this was for a particular kind of street typology, but it said like the base configuration, it said like 2 to 3 lanes per direction. So like if you, like I'm looking at the travelway category, right? And so it says travelway is a higher priority, and then base configuration without overlays is separated bike lanes, 2 to 3 travel lanes per direction, transit lanes and medians. So that's without overlays. So then when you go down into, like, let's say this is on a bike priority network, how does that change that? And particularly if our modal hierarchy has sort of private car use on the bottom, how does our starting assumption start with 2 to 3 travel lanes and then have the bike priority network kind of fighting for space after that's been established as a base?
So, the base configuration is really intended to be where there's no overlay. It's just, it's the most basic version of it. The hierarchy still applies. So transit would still be, higher, bike would be higher than the travel lane. So if you were in this street type, whatever this is referring to, and you did not have any overlays, you would try to fit in separated bike lanes and 2 or 3 travel lanes. But if you could not fit all of that in, you would say, well, let's drop down to 2 travel lanes per direction first in order to get the separated bike lanes in, because let's just assume based on the traffic volumes and speeds, it needs to be separated. It can't be just a standard bike lane in order to be all ages and abilities. That would be the approach that you should take there. If you're on the bike priority network piece, I think it just at that point would just more reinforce to say, like, you have to do something here to satisfy the all ages and abilities criteria, even if that means dropping down additional travel lanes. If it's not a transit priority network, then maybe it's we're not going to put in bus lanes on this street. We need to have that space for separated bike lanes, for example. That would sort of be the approach I would take. Now, if we get down to a high traffic street, let's say it's not bike priority, but it is one of those high traffic streets, that might be a case where we say, the trade-off here is we can't fit the travel lanes to maintain the capacity and separated bike lanes. Maybe we put standard bike lanes on the street and we look at a parallel street for a really good bike boulevard. does that all happen as part of one project? I don't know. This is a process thing that'll need to be worked out, but that's sort of like the decision-making approach that could be taken in a situation like that. And I think at one point we sort of talked about the like Willie Street, Jenny, Wilson, sort of the three parallel streets, and how, at least right now, they're sort of each emphasizing different things. You know, that could be one approach to take when you're trying to deal with the trade-offs and everything wants to be in one place, but you just can't fit it all in. So there's judgment that would have to happen in here. But I think with this being sort of like a published thing, it's, you know, if it's being interpreted wrongly in a way that everyone can see is not, you know, the interpretation that would make sense, I think there's sort of there's an accountability piece to that. If it says this is what we want to prioritize, but that's not what's happening, I think this is something to point to as an example. So again, it's not the prescriptive answer, but it's kind of trying to get to a kind of a philosophical approach for how to make those determinations. And as I said, this is a mock-up, and this is like our next big. If it's like, yeah, this is making sense, then we're going to really invest the time to work this all out. If it's no, then I'm glad we didn't spend a whole lot of time going through the detail, because there is going to be a lot of detail in this and a lot of thinking that goes into it.
No, that sounds good. I think it does make sense. I think maybe just as you're doing that more detailed work, then, I mean, the things that really stand out for me are, you know, on-street parking and multiple travel lanes, right? And these are the things that realistically could be adjusted. And if we're kind of true to the modal hierarchy, I would consider doing the base configuration sort of more minimal, right? Like, and maybe because of this example, you're expecting some, you know, you're expecting it to carry a certain amount of car volume, but like base configuration, I mean, should have emergency vehicle access, right? Like in one direction. And then if you like, oh, we've got more space. Okay, we could have a two-way street. Oh, we got more space. Okay, you could have 2 lanes in each direction. I think just being, I guess, thoughtful or careful about at what point we're inserting those kind of expectations around kind of motor vehicle capacity, because that's one that I think is an easy one to just sort of have those assumptions around. And I think this will be most powerful and useful where we really sort of kind of force walking down the line, right, in that priority order, and then recognizing, yeah, we shouldn't be talking about adding a third lane in each direction if we don't have those separated bike lanes yet. So maybe there's a way to kind of emphasize that, I guess, with this. I think the last question I had was around the bike priority network. And yeah, I mean, I think there will be a lot of interest in it. I think I was on that MPO group when we passed or created that last bike plan, and there was a lot of conversation and probably this like actual confusion around like, what did that mean? Like, what did the primary route mean? You know, primary versus secondary, and like, is this about places that are good to bike now or places we want to be good to bike? And so I think that whole thing probably deserves some additional conversation because it's not quite clear in my mind yet. And I know on that map that came from MPO, that was sort of, something got put out there, but I think I'm just left, I guess, with some big questions around that. And then I do think it would be maybe once there's a good answer kind of for that, I think this would be a great thing to lean on some of the community groups that have, you know, connections with a lot of folks that are very familiar with the bike networks. And I think we can get some real specific feedback on it, but probably before doing that, it would be good to really nail down what do we mean if we call something a primary route, and yeah, how much should it be aspirational? And we say there should be a primary route here, even though we know today it stinks to ride a bike on, versus no, we're actually just drawing kind of the best routes today. And I think there's some tension there that would be worth sorting out. And I think that's my only last comment.
I would just quickly give my short answer is that in the complete streets framework, we should be thinking aspirationally. We should be mapping out what we want to have. And that gives us the vision to get there.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, yeah, sorry. My final comment was I like the overlay priority slide you had that showed context. It makes a lot of sense to have transit ahead of bike, for example, because we have fewer routes. And if it's a transit route, like, I think to me, it's clear that that should come first. In the broader, like, overall modal hierarchy, I'm still not sold of that sort of differentiation. And I think I still like that Minneapolis one, I think it was, where they, transit and bike were on the same level. And after seeing the additional kind of feedback, et cetera, that it seems like that would be consistent with that as well. So I guess I will put one more plug in to reimagine putting, walking and wheelchair up top, transit and biking next, and then the other ones, but then maintaining the differentiation in the overlay component so that it's clear that if it really does come down between buses and bike priority, I'm supportive of keeping that that priority there. Thank you.
All right. Any further questions, comments, discussion? Seeing any more hands up? Oh. All right, then that's all we have for the evening. Last call for questions, comment, discussion from members of the board. All right, I would entertain motions to adjourn.
Move adjournment.
Thank you, Alder Furman. Is there a second? Second by Randy. Thank you. All those in favor of adjourning the meeting for this evening, please unmute yourselves and say aye.
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 Opposed, no. That sounds unanimous. We're adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.